Okay, first I want to thank the organizers and especially Marco, Jean-Pierre, and Colin, who at the last minute were called in to help me make sense of how this approach bears on the work of Grothendieck. So what I'm going to do is outline an approach to philosophy of mathematics that builds an account of foundations out of the actual practice of mathematics and not out of some philosophical desire to provide a metaphysics for mathematics. I'm going to do that, believe it or not, by tracing this account to Plato. So I'm beginning at the beginning. So I'm going to begin with Plato. I'm going to show that Plato himself was not a mathematical Platonist, that in fact he separates out the method of philosophy from the method of mathematics, and he does not hold mathematics to the method of philosophy. That's a confusion that's made greatly in the philosophical literature. So I'm going to develop what I call an as-ifist account of mathematics. And then I'm going to use that as-ifist account of mathematics to compare it to general philosophical accounts that one finds, namely to if-then-ism, and then apply that to questions in foundations of mathematics and show that we as philosophers should be paying more attention to the practice of mathematics. And I'm going to use as an example of Grothendieck, and then I will take that to bear on what's the sense in which we should take category theory as a foundation. And I'm going to argue it should be in this methodological or as-if-ist sense. I might skip some of the quotes because I think for time, but if anybody wants me to pause on those, I can certainly do that. So Plato kept a clear distinction between mathematics and metaphysics. And the knife he used to carve the difference between the two of those was method. He's very clear that the mathematician's hypothetical method reasons down from hypothesis towards a conclusion for the purpose of solving a mathematical or philosophical problem. Okay, the quotes there, again, we can go back. The philosopher's dialectical method, in contrast, reasons up from a hypothesis towards a first principle, which is supposed to tether or fix their hypothesis. And only then does he reason down from first principles with the purpose of solving a philosophical problem. The mathematician's hypotheses are thus taken, and this is where I get the term as-if-ism. The mathematician's hypotheses are taken as if they were true first principles, but they are not. This is what he said. Students of geometry, calculation, and the like hypothesize the odd and the even, the various figures. We go further down. They treat their hypothesis as if they were first principles and do not think it necessary to give an argument for or account of them, either to themselves or to others. They treat them as if they were evident to everyone. And consistently going from these first principles through remaining steps, they arrive or conclude in full agreement with the question they've set out to solve. So the purpose of the mathematician's method, which begins by taking hypotheses as if they were first principles, is to solve a mathematical, a metamathematical, or a physical question. It is not, however, to give a philosophical account of hypotheses as if they were first principles. I'm going to repeat that. The philosopher of mathematics is not tasked with giving a first principled account of mathematical uses of hypotheses. So against metaphysical reading of Plato, mathematics does not need a metaphysics of forms or a domain of stable mathematical objects, that is, first principles, accounts for or tethers the truth of its hypothesis. These differences in methodology demand differences in both epistemology and in ontology. So the mathematical method requires objects as what Plato calls them is objects of thought. And he says that leads a kind of understanding. The philosophical method, on the other hand, requires objects as objects of understanding and yields true understanding or knowledge itself. So at an epistemological level, for philosophers, they have understanding. Mathematicians, they have a kind of understanding, right? Mathematical objects, those are objects of thought. Philosophical objects, those are forms. And Plato here is being willfully provocative, because what comes next is Glaucon's shock that what Plato is saying is that the science of philosophy is more certain than mathematics. And Plato intends for this to be the case, and he intends for it to be a shock. And again, I won't read the quote, but Glaucon's shocked. Okay, so the hypothetical method of mathematics is distinct from the metaphysical method of philosophy. And as such, again, so is its epistemology and ontology. The mathematical method yields a kind of understanding, that it yields beliefs that, and this is what Plato says, are reliable guides to solving problems, because they are born out of stable definitions and a reliable method. So again, what does mathematics rely on? It relies on stable definitions and a reliable method. It does not rely on stable objects and the method or the philosophy's method of fixing these hypotheses. So philosophy as a science is to be founded on the dialectical method and the stability of metaphysical objects, that is forms, whereas mathematics as a science is founded on the hypothetical method and the stability of definition. So the confusion that I see in philosophy of mathematics is that as philosophers of mathematics, we've continued to conflate the hypothetical method of mathematics with the metaphysical method of philosophy. The correction that I'm going to try to work out here today is when I say a mathematical object exists, what I mean is that I treat my hypothesis as if it were true, right, for the purpose of solving a problem. And in virtue of taking my hypothesis as if it was true, I'm now committed to saying, I take this object as if it exists. So I recognize that my hypotheses, however, are not first principles. So my object is an object of thought. Plato calls them as well objects of conjecture. But I treat my object as if it exists for the purpose of solving a mathematical problem. So I'm going to summarize what Plato's trying to get at here. So here's what Plato's trying to do in the Meno. He's trying to show against Pythagorean views of numbers that we can include irrational numbers as objects. So what does he do? He asks the question, okay, look, I have a square. It has a side of unit 2. I want to double the area of that. That is, I want to make it, instead of area 4, I want it to have area 8. What is the length of the side that I'm going to construct that square on? And it turns out that the length of that side is 2 root 2. You'll see there's a typo at the very last side. It says, since it is 2, it's supposed to be since it is 2 root 2. So again, he's now bringing in that object, that 2 root 2, as an object of thought for the purpose of solving a problem. And the way he does that is by relying on a stable definition of a square, a stable definition of a diagonal, and the Pythagorean theorem. So I'm going to characterize now what I take as Plato's methodological as-if-ism. In mathematics, we treat our hypotheses as if they were true first principles, and consequently our objects as if they exist, and we do this for the purpose of solving either a mathematical problem, a meta-mathematical problem, or physical. So as if mathematical realism is distinct from metaphysical realism. For the as if mathematical realist, existence is a consequence of truth. So I have my hypothesis. I take those as if they were true because I'm trying to solve a problem. And it's in virtue of taking them as true that I'm now committed to the existence of my object. Notice that it's exactly the opposite in philosophy. Right? In philosophy, right, truth is a consequence of existence. So I'm now going to skip ahead by 2,000 years just for fun, and extend this as-if-ism to modern mathematics. So instead of talking about taking our hypotheses as if they were true, I'm going to talk about taking our axioms as if they were true. So the claim here is that mathematics as a science is founded on the axiomatic method and the stability of its definitions, now implicitly expressed by the axioms themselves. So I'm taking the notion of axiom as a Hilbertian notion, that what axioms do is implicitly define the objects we're talking about. Again, to keep in mind that mathematics here is not founded on the stability of metaphysical objects. So of course, this is a shift that goes on, and it's a shift that's well reflected in the Frege-Hilbert debate. So I'm going to turn to that just briefly to kind of pull out where I see these differences. So Frege, I take as an example as someone who confuses the method of mathematics with the method of philosophy. That is, with the method that he takes of concept construction. He takes axioms as first principles and so presumes that we need a stable domain of objects to fix their truth. So the Fregean axioms as first principles, the primitive terms employed by the axioms must be defined over a fixed domain before the statement of the axiom. They must be logically constructed in the case of arithmetic or Kantian constructed in the case of geometry. Hilbert, however, takes axioms as if they were first principles. He takes them as implicit definitions so that whatever satisfies the axioms is taken as an object. So Hilbert takes our axioms as implicit definitions over a variable domain, so that the axiom systems themselves are but, and these is his term, schema for defining those concepts expressed as primitive terms that are variously interpreted. So for Frege, the stability of mathematical definitions was to be justified by assuming the truth of the axiom. Truth as fixed logically, again, in the case of arithmetic, or as fixed by Kantian intuition. Frege's meta-mathematical account of the method of mathematics was as follows, and here I'm pulling out that if-then-ism that we find as an interpretation of mathematics. So one could schematize Frege's view as if the axioms are true, then the theorems could be justified. For Hilbert, the stability of definitions was justified by assuming the consistency of the axiom. Hence, we have Hilbert's famous quote, if the arbitrarily postulated axioms do not contradict each other with their collective consequences, then they are true, and the things defined by them by means of the axioms exist. That for me is the criteria of truth and existence. So Hilbert's meta-mathematical schema is something like, if the axioms are consistent, then the theorem can be justified. So if-then-ism is a standard approach in philosophy of mathematics. However, fearing formalism, both Frege and Hilbert rejected if-then-ism. And as a meta-mathematical account, for Frege, he thought that that was going to reduce mathematics to a game of meaningless symbols. For Hilbert, it was in light of the Gödel results that he realized that as a mathematical schema, this was not going to work. So what I'm now going to consider, and the reason why I consider this is when I was working out my category theory, several philosophers used to say, oh, that's just going to reduce to if-then-ism. And I thought, what are they saying? How is there if-then-ism? And so I had to work out, how is my account not an if-then-ist account? So what I'm going to argue is that if we take this logically interpreted if-then-ist view and we weaken it to this methodological as-if view that I think Plato holds, that gives us a better account not only of the practice of mathematics, but the foundational role that category theory plays. I know it seems like a stretch, so here I'm going to turn to some of the structuralism literature in philosophy of mathematics. So as detailed by Resnick, Frege developed two forms of if-then-ism according to the first deductive or logical if-then-is option. Mathematics is in the business of establishing results in pure logic. Won't read that. So the first option, right? So here we're really looking at deductivism in that Hilbert program sense. My symbols didn't come out. That's supposed to be the single turnstile. On the second structural if-then-is option, Frege offers a different account. He views mathematical theory as studying the properties of all structures satisfying certain defining conditions, but never makes use of the assumption that that structure exists. This option is expressed as the double turnstile. So you express this in terms of satisfiability. Resnick notes that such a structuralist view can rid mathematics of the ontological presuppositions while retaining its apparent descriptive character, and reduce the epistemology of mathematics to that of logic, and account for the centrality of proof in mathematics. Noting yet another virtue, Resnick further claims that this structural approach offers a straightforward account of applicability. That is, when one finds a physical structure that satisfies the axioms, the application of that theory is immediate. So when you cast everything in terms of satisfiability instead of provability, you get more purchase. You get more purchase not only mathematically, but also in terms of applicability. Finally, he notes that this structural if-then-ist approach is in line with the development of abstract structures like group theory, topology, and he says even category theory. And this is an article from 1980. So having a philosopher mention category theory in 1980 was shocking. So let's look at some of the problems that are pointed out with this structural if-then-ism, because the account I've just given is it's structural, but it still has this logical if-then-ist approach to it. So the first is known as the structure problem. Some of you might know it as Hellman's home address problem. And it says, well, we're going to need set theory or some other theory as a background theory of structures themselves. So Hellman says, well, let me offer you this modal structuralist account of possible structures. And then we have Shapiro's account of actual structures. Resnick, however, is quick to remind us that the structural if-then-ist need not make any use of existence assumptions of set theory, that one can remain agnostic with respect to the existence of mathematical structures. That's important because notice what's going on, right? The structure problem really is that philosopher's problem of saying, oh, look, you need a background theory. You need this background metaphysical theory. So the benefits, however, of remaining agnostic is that we can take this Carnapian approach. That is, we can look at that mathematics gives us a linguistic framework that's referential and thus agrees with the referential character of mathematical language as used by the practicing mathematician. So here we have this one camp that's saying you need this metaphysics of structures, and whatever that metaphysics of structures is, you better take the theory that talks about those things as true, unconditionally true. And then on the other hand, we have the Carnapian that says, no, just take your theory of structures as a language. And what I want to try to do is carve out a midpoint. One that avoids commitments to taking structures as metaphysical things, and at the same time says, well, it's more than a language. The other problem that's pointed out in the literature is the consistency problem. This is Shapiro's, you're either going to have to turn to logic or turn to philosophy. So he says, this is Shapiro, the possible infinite regress of relative consistency proofs will only be stopped by a true theory. Otherwise, like Frege, we'll need to turn to logic or turn to philosophy to account for the truth of our background theory. That is our theory of structures. So faced with these problems, Resnick presents us again with two alternative philosophical routes. We can take the Fregean route of turning to philosophy and base the assumption of consistency on a belief in the mathematical reality and truth of some theory, which will vouchsafe the consistency of mathematical theories in general. That I'm calling the metaphysical route. And I characterize both Shapiro and Hellman as taking that metaphysical route. On the other hand, we can take this Carnapian route of turning to logic and offer up a relative consistency proof. We can argue that since consistency itself is a mathematical question, it too must be treated deductively. So the assertion that a given axiom set is consistent must itself be constructed as conditional upon a background theory. And this is the key part, with respect to whose truth the deductivist can remain agnostic. Right? So the idea here is we choose some theory, we assume it's consistent for the purpose of getting on to solve a problem. Right? If we want to say, okay, well, how do I know it's consistent? We can offer up a relative consistency proof. But in offering up a relative consistency proof, we're again solving a problem. That doesn't mean we're committed to the truth of that background. So Resnick, Shapiro, Hellman, and what I call metaphysical foundationalists take the Fregean route. I'm going to opt for a Carnapian route, but instead of turning to logic to analyze this if-then-ist deductively, right? If we take this theory to be a theory of structures, then we're going to blah, blah, blah. I'm going to turn to mathematical problems themselves and analyze my as-if relation methodologically. So what does that mean? So remember, we're trying to compare metaphysically interpreted structuralism, right? That's the view that says you need a theory of structure, and that theory of structure must be taken as true. And as true, you must be ontologically committed to things called structures, either as actual things or as possible things. And I'm going to contrast that with a methodological approach. So again, let's recall the basic premise of Plato's methodological as-if-ism, that mathematics is used to solve mathematical, metamathematical, physical problems, and in virtue of these uses, we are justified in taking our hypotheses as if they were true. So likewise, let's presume that a basic premise of methodological structural as-if-ism, I got to come up with an acronym for that, is that mathematics is used to solve mathematical, metamathematical, physical problems, and that in virtue of these uses, we are mathematically justified in taking our set of axioms as if they were consistent for the purpose of giving us truth and existence, and metamathematically justified in taking our background theory as if it were true for the purpose of giving us a relative consistency proof. So all of the things that I do in my mathematical practice, right? I'm bound by some criteria, whether those are things like truth or consistency, but I'm not bound to taking those as though they were fixed notions and notions fixed by a background universe. I didn't mean universe in that sense. So taking this methodological route, by placing our focus on what is needed for the practice of mathematics, we're not committed to the unconditional consistency of our mathematical axioms, nor the unconditional truth of our meta-mathematical background. It's methodological considerations, not metaphysical ones, that condition our as-if assumptions, both those of the consistency of our mathematical axiom and the truth of our meta-mathematical background theory. What's important about this approach, and strikingly different from these metaphysical foundationalist approach, is that this allows for a pluralist approach to mathematical practice, one which puts the working mathematician's methods, logics, theories at the forefront of any account of mathematical practice. Because again, right, you take your axioms or your hypothesis as if they were true for the purpose of solving a problem. So it's the problem that's leading you to the selection of your methods, of your logic, of your theories. There is no one method, no one logic, no one theory of mathematics. There is no one logical or metaphysical account of the way things are in the mathematical realm. So again, this is that robust Platonism that seems to plague philosophy of mathematics. There is simply the desire to solve mathematical problems. So for example, while the category axioms can be used to talk about mathematical structures themselves, this is only if these structures are taken as small. As we've seen, we can bring in universes, but we don't, again, as Colin outlined, we don't just bring in universes as an alternative to set theory. We bring it in to make more perspicuous the problem that we're trying to solve. So it's the problem that's telling us, oh, let's bring in this. Now we might want to then pause and say, how is bringing this in bearing up against my background theory of set theory, right? And then we ask, well, which one of those are we going to give up, right? Are we going to talk about universes in a different way? Are we going to talk about set theory in a different way? But there's a negotiation that happens. And if you read the philosophical literature on foundation, all of that negotiation is lost. Because the presumption is, well, there's going to be one set theory as a background theory, or there's going to be one category theory. So what we get then is a methodological version of structuralism, which I call as-if-ism, which is much like Maddie has a new approach to if-then-ism, which she calls enhanced if-then-ism. So that we agree with Maddie that mathematics is a matter of figuring out what follows from what, where the concepts and axioms in the if part are chosen with the eye of facilitating important mathematical goals. But as distinct from Maddie's approach, we do not analyze the what follows from what part in terms of a logical deductivist reading of that if-then. Rather, we analyze that in terms of a methodological interpretation of this as-if, right? This as-if approach that we take. So my proposed methodological as-if structuralist position is even more enhanced than Maddie's. Some of our commitments to taking axioms as if they were first principles will be made in light of mathematical practice with the goal of solving a mathematical problem. Some will be made in light of philosophical or logical considerations with the goal of solving meta-mathematical problems. Right? And I think, again, let's just pause, because in the philosophy of mathematics literature, those two often get conflated. People aren't clear about whether their theory of structure is being brought in to talk about a mathematical problem or a meta-mathematical problem. These are distinct things. And then finally, some will be made in light of mathematical applicability with the goal of solving physics problems. But none of these commitments will be made with the goal of solving metaphysical problems. That is, problems about what fixes the consistency of our axioms, or what fixes the truth of our background. And it's those questions that philosophers of mathematics, or at least some of them, have been focused on. What's fixing truth? What's fixing consistency? So against metaphysical structuralism, mathematics does not need a metaphysics of structures that fixes or conditions the truth of its axioms. And that's, when Hellman comes and says, you have a home address problem, where do your categories live? That's the problem he's falling into. Because he's saying, you need a theory of existence of these things. Where are they? So let's pause now. And this is where I thank Marco tremendously for sharing his slides. To situate Grothendieck and his account of mathematical practice as seen now from within this methodological approach. So recall that on my view, mathematics as a science is founded on the hypothetical method and the stability of its definition. It is not founded on a dialectical method and the stability of any objects. So this explains Grothendieck's attention to definitions and to the precision of a definition, to his aims of making them more stable, but also to his view that definitions themselves express but points of view. So there's a flexibility. There's the idea that you make a definition stable and precise, not by
Your
fixing it.
definition is not very stable.
No,
Is it your computer disappeared?
no, I don't know.
Ah, well.
Oh, it's over there. I don't know.
So that's not good mathematics.
There's no stability anymore.
No stability. Okay.
There we go. All right.
Stability.
Right. So you have stable definitions, but they're not fixed. They're points of view. By asking new questions, by offering up new stable definitions, by making them more precise in the context of a problem, by attempting to solve new problems, we come to see that these points of view can converge to what he calls great ideas. All of these bright blue, these are all from Grothendieck himself. So these points of view then converge to great ideas or single themes that can be used to solve more problems. And these two visions or schematic themes, such as schemes, topos, and sheaves. And that these can be used for foundational work. And what does he mean here by foundational work? He means problems set at unifying, at organizing. So it's not this, it's unifying, it's organizing, it's not fixing. So the mathematician's task then is thus fourfold. To see questions that underlie mathematical problems. Again, this is all Grothendieck. To see the needed good notions and statements that'll make these questions themselves more precise. To give expression to these ideas, visions, and themes via stable definitions that clears them, quote, from the veils of myth. And finally, to use these to solve problems. The mathematician's philosophical task is to deny that there is a mathematical universe fixed once and for all. This is, remember at Marco's talk when he talked about the problem that people take of routine mathematics. They assume that they have to inherit the universe that's given to them. But nonetheless, the mathematician acts as if she was grasping mathematical reality, right? So there is a point, and this was at the end of Marco's talk about, do we create, do we discover, does that presume Platonism? But then Marco was quick to say, well, I don't mean Platonism in the crazy sense of independently existing things. On my account, right, is we act as if. That's what motivates us. That's what allows us to be creative. So again, I go back to Plato, because as I was reading Marco's slides, I was reminded, so the first instance where Plato brings up this hypothetical method is in response to what is known as Meno's paradox. how are you going to look for something if you don't know in the least what it is? How will you know that you found it? Right? And the problem is that if we're not, it seems like if we're not committed to these existing mathematical objects, then we just float about and we say, well, mathematics is just a socially constructed endeavor. But the difference is that if we act as if there are these truths, we act as if there are these objects. This is Plato's phrase, we become energetic seekers after knowledge. So while, we have on the one hand Platonism, those objects do exist independently of us. And on the other hand, we have, no, it's just a handy language. There is a and the midpoint says that it's beneficial for the practice of mathematics to act as if these things were true. And in virtue of acting as though these things are true, to act as if these things exist. And why? Because that keeps us going, that motivates us. So, and I don't know what the time is, so I might end here, which means that I don't get to talk about the sense in which I take category theory as a foundation, but it's on Grothendieck, so it's fine. I am happy to share the slides with you. So Marco had this initially in his slides, and I thought it was particularly telling. So as Grothendieck sees it, the error of Bourbaki's notion of structure is that it's purely linguistic ordering of ideas. Here's what he says. Without bringing any new idea of its own, this new idea should be that of a rigorous mathematical definition of the notion of structure. But this idea is akin, Bourbaki idea, is akin to that of an intelligent and imaginative lexicographer. I mean, I don't know if you see the hidden insult in there, but it's brilliant. Then to an element of the renewal of a language, giving a new apprehension of reality. So the problem with Bourbaki's notion is that it's too linguistic. It's not leading us to apprehend, to be energetic seekers after what's giving rise to this notion of structure. So the preferred idea of structure is not purely linguistic, but rather is an expressed idea, which further we take as if it were an apprehension of a fixed mathematical reality. That's me adding in the as if there. This task, we are told, was overtaken by events with the influx of categorical methods. So it is by looking to categorical methods, that is by taking our categorical axioms as if they were first principles, that we are to find the idea of structure expressed as if it were a mathematical object. And I'm going to stop.